Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is integrated into the individual's conscious life, the darker and denser it becomes. If an inferiority is conscious, there is always a chance to correct it. But if it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it is never corrected and can suddenly explode in a moment of inattention. Either way, it becomes an unconscious obstacle that gets in the way of our best intentions. Carl Jung talks about two types of shadows: the personal shadow, the unknown shadow side of our personality, and the collective shadow, the unknown shadow side of society. Starting with the personal shadow, Jungian theory describes how what a person does not wish to be represents unknown or little-known attributes and qualities of the ego. It is the sum of all the unpleasant qualities that we like to hide from ourselves. The shadow contains inferiorities that everyone has but prefers not to recognize because they seem weak, socially unacceptable, or even evil. The shadow is most visible when we are overcome by anxiety or other emotions, under the influence of alcohol, etc. When we can suddenly make a hostile remark during a friendly conversation, when we do not want to assimilate what we despise, we project it onto others. It is possible to know one's own shadow and be partially aware of it, that is, under the influence of alcohol. Control of the ego. Many people, however, refuse to acknowledge their shadow to such an extent that the ego is not even aware of the shadow's behavior and therefore has no way of controlling it. Under these conditions, the shadow is autonomous and can express itself in inexplicable moods, irritability, and cruelty. Throughout his writings, Jung highlights the importance of developing awareness of the shadow in psychotherapy and its projections into the individual's life. Although the shadow is generally perceived as negative, it can also be positive. In fact, it can be exploited. Our shadow gives us access to many positive qualities. Jung writes that the shadow exhibits a number of good qualities such as normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic instincts, creative impulses, etc. One of Jung's closest collaborators, Marie-Louise von Franz, writes that the shadow is not necessarily always a person. In fact, it is exactly like any human being with whom one must live, sometimes giving in, sometimes resisting, sometimes giving love whatever the situation demands. The shadow becomes hostile only when it is ignored or misunderstood. The shadow contains all kinds of qualities, strengths, and potentials that if not explored lead us to a state of impoverishment in our personality, creating unconscious obstacles that inhibit the growth and incorporation of these good qualities that remain dormant in our psyche. For example, a person may believe that being assertive means being rude or aggressive, losing the qualities of confidence and the ability to speak for oneself honestly and respectfully. This can lead to less proactivity, making it difficult to get a raise or promotion at work, having financial difficulties, and so on. So when this person meets someone assertive, deep down they feel resentment and guilt, making their shadow darker and denser. These valuable aspects must be assimilated into real experience and not repressed. It is up to the ego to abandon its pride. We also find our shadow in dreams, as a person of the same sex as the dreamer. It is what seems to be a criticism of our character coming from the unconscious and internal judge of our own being that reprimands us. The result is usually an embarrassed silence. We must identify the content of the shadow and integrate it into our personality. This is the process of realizing the shadow, also known as working with the shadow. Here begins the painful and long work of self-education, where one must enter into long and difficult negotiations with the shadow, a work that we can say is the psychological equivalent of the labors of Hercules. Through shadow work, one can observe the shadow externally, observing one's own emotional reactions and being radically honest about interactions with others. Internally, exploring one's dreams. This allows one to become enlightened and reduce the destructive potential of the shadow, not so much by waging war against the darkness, but by bringing the darkness into the light, and the light into the darkness. As Jung writes, there is no light without shadow, and there is no psychic wholeness without imperfection. We should not seek perfection, but rather the wholeness of the personality. The process of individuation throughout life creates a balance between the conscious and unconscious realms, aligning the ego with the self, the wholeness of the personality, no matter how frightening or dark it may be. Confronting our shadow, finding the truth, brings relief. Discerning the truth is the process of authenticity, a meticulous excavation into the depths of our being to explore possibilities and limitations, distortions, and the buried and often forgotten parts of ourselves and our abilities. Most people, however, are too indolent to think deeply about even the moral aspects of their behavior, which are conscious. The more one considers how the unconscious affects them, the more they understand the shadow. The shadow can also consist of factors that arise from a source outside the individual's personal life. This is where we encounter the collective shadow, the dark side, or the unknown or little-known aspects of a society and culture. It consists of that which opposes our shared and collective values. The collective shadow refers to a huge, multidimensional, often horrific but elusive aspect of human life, the immensity of harm inflicted by human beings on each other and the natural world, and the vast after-effects of such harm on subsequent generations. We find the collective shadow in the projection of darkness and inferiority, in violence and oppression, in the invisibility of present suffering, in the denial of present responsibility. While the material of the collective shadow can be brutally enacted in wars, massacres, and genocides, it can also hide under the often attractive cloaks of missionary activities, such as the imposition of the use of specific languages and Orwellian reality that we are currently experiencing. As is the nature of all shadow material, whether individual or collective, its existence and influence can be pervasive without being obvious. The collective shadow manifests itself externally in atrocities, persecution, physical suffering, disease, poverty, malnutrition, alcoholism, crime, the death of cultures, and so on. It can also manifest more internally amidst the layers of each individual psyche as self-hatred of one's heritage and culture, depression, feelings of helplessness, the desire for revenge so that others may experience something like one's own pain, etc. The collective shadow is what has historically been labeled as evil. In the Christian tradition, it would be the devil, and someone who is possessed by the devil loses their human quality and acquires a demonic nature. Our primary response to evil must be the search for self-knowledge through totality, which presupposes the assimilation of the dark material. The individual must relentlessly know how much good they can do and what crimes they are capable of. When there is a known problem in a specific society, it can be called a dark problem if there is evidence of denial, projection, and lack of individual and collective responsibility. Therefore, taking moral responsibility politically and spiritually is particularly crucial. The courage with which we bear our darkness frees others from having to carry it for us. For example, to respond to historical suffering in mass wars, genocides, holocausts, pervasive oppression, etc., whose effects persist as human beings, we have much to learn. Denial, often connected with a desire to move on and put the past behind us, seems the most common approach and often the first reaction. There are, and have been, many attempts to deal with difficult and painful pasts through public apologies for supporting atrocities, repentance, reparation payments after wars, pilgrimages to places of great suffering, etc. But how do we deal with the past in such a way that the integration of the shadow occurs deeply and widely within a population rather than simply at a symbolic level through laws or policies? Remembering and speaking what often seems unspeakable is inevitably a painful process for victims and perpetrators, bystanders and witnesses. Any such process can only be considered successful, or reasonably complete, when the pain, outrage, betrayal, grief, and all other feelings have been expressed and heard, and when responsibility has been taken. Telling the truth is both the most desirable and the most feasible way of dealing with a difficult past. An example of a terrible mass psychosis represented by the collective shadow is Nazi Germany, where people fell into a demonic nature through their personal shadow. They joined the Nazi Party and did worse things than they could have imagined or would have done under normal social conditions. In this sense, the personal shadow is the bridge to the collective shadow. Therefore, it is important to first resolve the internal conflicts, the personal shadow, so that we do not fall into the collective shadow unconsciously. We can then influence other people, and society as a whole will be better. If we practice mindfulness, we will know how to look deeply into the nature of war, and with our perception, wake people up so that together we can avoid repeating the same horrors over and over again. The war is in us, but it is also in everyone. Everything is ready to explode, and we are all co-responsible. To summarize, We must first recognize our personal shadow and enter into long and difficult negotiations with it, being honest with ourselves and our interactions with others, observing our emotional reactions and exploring our dreams so as not to become passive victims of our shadow and our unconscious projections. This allows us to rescue the good qualities that are dormant within us, which improves our lives and the lives of those around us. We can then be aware of the collective shadow and not fall prey to it, and take responsibility for addressing the denial of important issues and the lack of individual and collective initiative. The courage to endure our darkness brings relief to others, because telling the truth is the most desirable way to deal with a difficult past, instead of ignoring the atrocities and letting the shadow grow bigger and bigger until it can grow no more. And thus, history repeats itself.